To understand the events of 1992 that left a man dead on the floor of London's most famous nightclub, you first have to understand the ecosystem of the city at that time. London in the early 90s was not the highly regulated, surveillance-heavy metropolis it is today. The nightlife of the West End, particularly around Leicester Square, was a frontier. It was a place where millions of pounds in cash changed hands, where celebrities partied with gangsters, and where the line between the law and the underworld was often blurred. At the center of this world was the Hippodrome. It was a cavernous, neon-lit palace, the beating heart of London's club scene. And guarding the doors of this palace was a man who had become a myth in his own lifetime, Lenny McLean. They called him the Governor. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing over 20 stone, McLean was not merely a bouncer. He was a figurehead of the East End's violent hierarchy. By 1992, he was perhaps the most feared man in Britain. He had forged his reputation, not in boardrooms, but in the brutal arenas of unlicensed boxing. He had fought thousands of street fights. He had engaged in legendary bloody rivalries with men like Roy Shaw. He was a man who claimed to have bit off ears, broken jaws, and dismantled opponents with a ferocity that bordered on the inhuman. The owners of the Hippodrome didn't hire Lenny McLean to check IDs or enforce a dress code. They hired him as a deterrent. His presence alone was usually enough to silence a room. However, on a Friday night in 1992, that deterrence failed. The result was a singular moment of violence that would end one life, ruin another, and change the face of British security forever. The victim was Gary Humphreys. In the years since his death, there have been conflicting descriptions of who Humphreys was, but the police reports and witness testimonies from that night paint a consistent picture of his behavior. Humphreys was not a rival gangster. He was not a professional fighter looking to challenge the governor for his crown. He was a patron who had lost control. Toxicology reports and witness statements suggest he was heavily intoxicated, likely a combination of alcohol and illicit substances, which fueled a manic, erratic episode. The trouble began inside the club. The Hippodrome was packed, a sea of bodies moving to the pounding rhythm of early 90s dance music. In the middle of this crush, Gary Humphreys began to act out. It started with nuisance behavior, bumping into people, shouting, acting aggressively. But it quickly escalated. Reports reached the security team that Humphreys was harassing women. The details were ugly. He was allegedly grabbing at female patrons, making lewd and threatening advances, and refusing to back down when challenged. In some accounts provided to the police, it was stated that Humphreys had begun to strip off his clothes, streaking through the crowded dance floor, creating a scene of absolute chaos. For Lenny McLean, this was not just a disturbance, it was a violation of a specific code. Lenny was a man of the old school. He was raised in the harsh, violent streets of Hoxton, where violence was a language, but it had grammar. It had rules. Rule number 1 was that you protected women and children. Rule number 2 was that you respected the territory. Humphreys was violating both. He was preying on women in Lenny's house. Lenny received the call over the radio. He moved from his position at the front door into the main body of the club. Witnesses later described the change in atmosphere. When Lenny McLean moved with purpose, the crowd parted. He was a massive, imposing figure, dressed in the standard black of the security trade, but he carried himself with the heavy, flat-footed gait of a heavyweight boxer. He wasn't rushing, he was stalking. He located Humphreys near the edge of the dance floor. The situation was volatile. Humphreys was shouting, flailing, and reportedly unresponsive to the initial verbal commands from the junior security staff. He was in a state of agitated delirium. In a modern security context, the protocol would be a team takedown, 3 or 4 guards immobilizing the subject's limbs and escorting him out. But in 1992, the protocol was Lenny. Lenny stepped into Humphrey's personal space. The interaction was brief. There was no prolonged negotiation. Lenny intended to eject the man. Humphreys, in his intoxicated state, arguably made a move or refused to comply. What happened next took less than a second. Lenny McLean threw a blow. This specific blow would become the subject of intense forensic analysis in the months that followed. In his subsequent trial, Lenny McLean was adamant about one detail. He did not punch Gary Humphreys. To Lenny, a punch was a specific mechanic, a closed fist, driven by the hips and shoulders, designed to destroy bone and tissue. Lenny argued that he knew his own strength. He knew that if he hit a normal, untrained man with a full-force closed fist, the results would be catastrophic. So he claimed he pulled his punch. He delivered what he called a backhander. It was a slap, a strike with the back of the hand or the open palm, intended to stun, to humiliate, and to force compliance. It is a move common in the street fighting lexicon of the East End. It says, "You are not worth a punch." However, the physics of a slap from Lenny McLean were different from those of a normal human being. Lenny weighed nearly 300 pounds. He had spent decades conditioning his body to deliver impact. Even a casual, dismissive swing of his arm carried the kinetic energy of a sledgehammer. The blow connected with the side of Gary Humphreys' jaw. The impact was sickeningly loud. It was not the wet thud of a slap. It was the crack of bone giving way. But the damage went far deeper than a fracture. The force of the blow was so extreme that it violently rotated Humphreys' head. The human neck is not designed to withstand that level of torque. The sudden violent rotation caused severe trauma to the vertebrae and the spinal cord. It also likely caused a rapid, fatal hemorrhage. Gary Humphreys didn't stumble back. He didn't put his hands up to defend himself. His strings were cut. He dropped to the floor of the hippodrome instantly, a dead weight collapsing into the plush carpet. At that moment, nobody knew he was dead. The music was still playing. The lights were still flashing. To the onlookers and the other doormen, it looked like a standard knockout. The governor had hit a troublemaker, and the troublemaker had gone to sleep. It was a scene that had played out hundreds of times in London clubs. The protocol was simple: drag him out, dump him on the pavement to wake up, and bar him for life. Lenny signaled to his team. "Get him out," he ordered. He turned his back, likely believing the incident was over. He had enforced the rules. He had protected the patrons. He returned to his post. But as the junior bouncers lifted Gary Humphreys, the reality of the situation began to set in. He was heavy in a way that unconscious men are heavy, but he was also terrifyingly still. His color was draining rapidly. He wasn't breathing. Panic began to ripple through the security team. They carried him to a back room or a quiet area and tried to revive him. They checked for a pulse. There was nothing. The police were called. The paramedics arrived, but there was no life to save. Gary Humphreys had been killed instantly by the single blow. The cause of death was later confirmed as severe injuries to the neck and jaw, consistent with a massive blunt force trauma. When the police arrived, they didn't just arrest a bouncer. They arrested a legend. Lenny McLean was taken into custody and charged with murder. The gravity of the charge cannot be overstated. In the UK, a murder conviction carries a mandatory life sentence. Lenny McLean, the man who had built an empire on his reputation for violence, was now facing the prospect of dying in prison for living up to that reputation. He was sent to Belmarsh Prison, a maximum security facility housing the country's most dangerous criminals. The investigation that followed stripped away the myth of the governor and looked at the cold, hard facts. The prosecution's case was simple. Lenny McLean was a violent man with a violent history who had lost his temper and beaten a man to death. They painted him as a bully who believed he was above the law. They argued that a man of his experience knew exactly how dangerous he was, and that striking a drunken smaller man in the face constituted an act of lethal intent. Lenny's defense team had a difficult task. They could not deny he hit him. There were witnesses. There was a body. Their only option was to argue intent. They had to prove that Lenny McLean did not mean to kill Gary Humphreys. The trial was a media sensation. It highlighted the dark underbelly of London's nightlife. Lenny took the stand in his own defense. He was an imposing figure in the dock, squeezing his massive frame into a suit, but he was also articulate. He spoke with the rough charisma of the working class. He told the jury exactly what he had told the police. "I didn't punch him." He explained the mechanics of his violence. He told the court, "If I had hit him with a closed fist, I would have taken his head off. I know what I can do. I didn't want to kill the lad. I just wanted to stop him behaving like an animal." It was a bizarre defense strategy, essentially arguing, "I am so dangerous that if I wanted him dead, it would have been messier." The fact that he died from a slap proves it was an accident. Pathologists were called to testify. They analyzed the injury. They confirmed that while the force was excessive, the specific mechanism of death, the whiplash effect, and the specific breakage was a freak occurrence. It was the 1,000,000-to-1 unlucky shot, a specific amount of force applied at a specific angle that resulted in a fatality. The jury deliberated. They had to decide between murder, intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm, and manslaughter, an unlawful act resulting in death without lethal intent. They found Lenny McLean not guilty of murder. However, they found him guilty of manslaughter. The court recognized that while he may not have intended to kill Humphreys, the force he used was disproportionate and reckless. A professional doorman should have been able to restrain a drunk man without breaking his neck. The judge sentenced Lenny to 18 months in prison. For the family of Gary Humphreys, the sentence was an insult. A man was dead, and the killer would be out in less than a year with good behavior. For Lenny's supporters, it was a victory against a system that didn't understand the realities of the street. Lenny served his time. He kept his head down, mostly. He wrote his autobiography, The Governor, inside his cell. The book became a bestseller, catapulting him from a London underworld figure to a national celebrity. But the story doesn't end with his release. In a twist of fate that seems scripted by Hollywood, Lenny McLean's post-prison life became even more surreal. A young director named Guy Ritchie was casting for a low-budget British gangster film. He needed someone to play Barry the Baptist, a terrifying enforcer who drowned people in debt. Ritchie didn't want an actor who could pretend to be tough. He wanted the real thing. He wanted the governor. Lenny was cast in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. It was the role he was born to play. On set, he was a presence that awed the cast. Vinnie Jones, a tough footballer turned actor, deferred to Lenny. The young actors looked at him with a mix of hero worship and genuine fear. But while Lenny was achieving the mainstream fame he had always craved, a different kind of justice was catching up with him. During the filming, Lenny began to feel ill. He had a persistent cough. He was losing weight. The man who had been invincible, who had survived stabbings, shootings, and thousands of fights, was crumbling. He was diagnosed with pleurisy, then pneumonia. But it was worse. It was lung cancer that had metastasized to his brain. The timeline is tragic. As Locke, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels was being edited and prepared for release, Lenny McLean was dying. He was bedridden, his massive frame wasting away. He never got to walk the red carpet. He never got to see the film that would make him a global icon of the British hard man archetype. He died on July 28, 1998, just weeks before the film premiered. The movie was dedicated to him. The death of Gary Humphreys and the subsequent death of Lenny McLean are inextricably linked in the narrative of British crime. The incident at the Hippodrome changed everything. Following the high-profile nature of the trial and other similar incidents in the 90s, the British government began to crack down on the security industry. The days of hiring a local hard man with a criminal record to run a door were numbered. The Security Industry Authority, SIA, was eventually formed, requiring background checks, training, and licensing for all doormen. The era of the governor was legislated out of existence. But if we strip away the movie stardom and the changes in the law, we are left with the raw, factual reality of that night in 1992. It serves as a grim case study in the unpredictability of violence. Lenny McLean was a weapon. He had forged himself into a weapon to survive an abusive childhood and a violent adulthood. When he encountered a problem, Gary Humphreys, he used the only tool he had. He used force. The title of this story emphasizes immediacy. And that's what he did. Immediately. This is the crucial detail. There was no hesitation. In the world Lenny came from, hesitation got you killed. If you paused in a bare-knuckle ring, you lost. If you paused in a street fight, you got stomped. His neural pathways were hardwired for instant reaction. When he saw Humphreys harassing women, the reaction was automatic. Stimulus, threat, response, neutralize. Lenny did not consider the angle of the jaw. He did not calculate the bone density of the victim. He simply lashed out. And in that split second, a life was extinguished. The tragedy of Gary Humphreys is often overshadowed by the legend of Lenny McLean. Humphreys is reduced to a footnote, the guy Lenny killed. But factual storytelling demands we remember the reality. Humphreys was a young man. He was acting foolishly, perhaps even criminally, but his sentence was not meant to be death. He died because he crossed paths with a force of nature that didn't have an off switch. The pathology of the backhander is particularly chilling. It highlights the vast disparity in physical power between a man like McLean and the average person. Most men could slap someone all day and only cause a red mark. Lenny McLean could slap someone and sever their spinal cord. It is a terrifying biological reality. In interviews before his death, Lenny spoke about the incident with a complex mix of defiance and regret. He maintained to the end that it was an accident, that he never meant to take a life, but he also carried the weight of it. He knew that for all his talk of being a protector, on that night he had failed. He had become the ultimate aggressor. The image of that night remains stark. The flashing strobe lights of the Hippodrome, the pounding bass, the crowd parting, and then the single devastating motion of a giant's arm. It is a story that strips the glamour away from the hard man image. We like to view men like Lenny McLean as protectors, as old-school heroes who kept the streets safe. And in many ways, he was. But the Hippodrome incident is the other side of that coin. It is the cost of having monsters guard the gates. Sometimes, the monster turns on the wrong person or strikes too hard. The legacy of the incident is a warning. It is a warning about the fragility of the human body. It takes surprisingly little to end a life. A fall on the pavement, a twist of the neck, a single blow. It is a warning about the permanence of violence. The anger Lenny felt lasted for a second. The consequences lasted forever. When you watch Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels today, and you see Lenny McLean growling at the camera, you are seeing a man who was, at that very moment, dying. But you are also seeing a man who was living with the knowledge that his hands, those massive shovel-like hands, visible in every frame, had taken a life. The factual account of the death of Gary Humphreys is not a mystery. There is no whodunit. We know who did it. We know how he did it. He did it with a slap. He did it because of a code of honor. And he did it immediately. The mystery lies in the human element. How a man can be a hero to some and a killer to others. How a slap can be a murder weapon. And how a nightclub in Leicester Square became the setting for a tragedy that ended the era of the classic British bouncer. Gary Humphrey's death was the final bell for the old East End. It was the moment the raw, unregulated violence of the street collided with the modern world, and the modern world decided it had had enough. Lenny McLean was the last of a dying breed, and that night in 1992 was the beginning of the end. The silence that followed that blow in the Hippodrome, the silence that settled over the body of Gary Humphreys while the party raged on around him, is the silence of reality. It is the silence that follows when the movie ends, when the anecdotes stop, and when the cold, hard fact remains. A man is dead because another man was too strong, too quick, and too conditioned to violence to stop himself. That is the true story. No glory, no glamour, just a crowded room, a flash of anger, and a body on the floor. Immediately,